just over a year ago, you wrote an amazing article, amazing essay that I read and was kind of, I don't know if it went viral per se, but at least in my community, a lot of people were sharing it. Lunar Punk and the Dark Side of the Cycle. We kind of teased out a little bit of these stuff, but I guess to ground us even more is that to recap is, cyberpunk visions against, totalitarian dystopia, et cetera, is using the things that you have at your toolkit, to subvert and kind of play guerrilla warfare tactics, if you will, against the powers that be. And then we have this kind of new thing come in, cryptocurrency, et cetera. But then it has a design philosophy that's very akin to solar punk, which is very bright and optimistic and, whatever. I wouldn't say utopic, but trending towards that direction a little bit more. And then lastly, you brought in this idea of the lunar punk, that we really have to kind of take in the unconscious if we're going to put on our our Jungian hats. We're gonna have to really deal with the unconscious. So and I'll read you one quote from your essay, and then I'll let you kind of just go to the races. Quote: "Solar punk is crypto's conscious mind. It is bright, self-confident, and future-oriented. Yet the counterpart to solar punk faith is lunar punk skepticism. Lunar punks are the solar shadow self. They are the unconscious of this cycle, while, quote, solar punks join DAOs," from your friend researcher Dylan Ennis. "Lunar punks are preparing for war and building privacy enhanced tooling to protect their communities." And I think that's super, super interesting, because I also am very involved in this other kind of space with the doomer optimism and bioregionalism, and how basically bioregions are really the kind of political, I guess you could say, substrate, because nation states now, the idea of that in 2023 is bunk. So I really enjoy the potentiality of this stuff, but then how do we get from lunar punk kind of applications other than DarkFi? I guess what is this next phase? What is these new financial kind of applications and things like that? And you started to go into that, but tell us how important lunar punk is, how important it is to kind of be skeptical about solar punk and then traditional mainstream crypto, and away we go.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's interesting because I put out this thesis. It's done, as you said, it was somewhat viral. People were sharing it around in certain communities. It's been interesting because it hasn't exactly been treated in the way I see a lot of people kind of using it for their own purposes. That's fine. That's what it should. That's how it should be. It's like a meme. It gets circulated around. But so it's been used a lot by different groups. Like one side is like actually cypherpunks who are rebranding to lunar punk. Is kind of like a funny dynamic. But then
do they just skip solar punk though? Do they just like leapfrog solar punk?
I think interestingly, a lot of the cypherpunks, some of them at least, they're not against solar punk, but they also, as cypherpunks, they understand the critique of lunar punk. And I guess one thing that is very easy to understand about lunar punk is just like in terms of the visuals, is like, oh, it's a point about privacy. And I think that is like fundamentally what, at least in that article, how it was framed, is like about privacy. But it also contains a kind of critique of both solar punks and also cypherpunk. So it's kind of, actually a friend described it really nicely, a kind of synthesis of the solar punk with the cypherpunk is kind of the lunar punk, because it combines elements of both. But it has a critique of them in that, the critique of cypherpunk is basically that it's still fundamentally anti-state. And so lunar punk is very much trying to be like a non-state, which means like moving beyond this like reactionary kind of dialectical relation with the state, which we see a lot in the cypherpunk aesthetic, where everything is very negative. We see it's a lot, oftentimes you see, even DarkFi, you see like inverted symbols, so and even notions of like parallelism. So it's like this, and like subculture, underground. There's a lot of this like of these kind of negational tactics, which I think are good to some degree, but then we have to keep in mind what Nietzsche warns us about when he talks about slave morality, where he says that basically copying the morality that's been imposed on you by the master, but you're flipping it and you're saying, oh, I'm not that, I'm the other thing, but you haven't actually managed to escape that dialectic, so you're still like constrained. So really what lunar punk wants to do is to like carve out a new path beyond the confines of like the like state-based society, and to establish a non-state which is like transcended this dialectic, which lunar or solar punk, which, you know, it's some of the solar punks are into like prefiguration and using these like positive visions to like create a future, to kind of conjure that future into being, like through that mimetic activity of like describing the future. So lunar punk will be closer to that, but it's also critical in that solar punk, as it has emerged in ETH, does come with like a lot of naivety, specifically when it comes to the design choices, like the software design choices.
Yeah.
So part of that is transparency, but it's also more, I think it's also broader than that. It also connects to like decentralization, to notions of sovereignty. For example, in Ethereum, a lot of the apps which are web-based, they're using centralized front ends. A lot of those, they link up to things like Cloudflare, which are, you know, they're basically dragging in a lot of surveillance tech, a lot of proprietary surveillance technology. And also, in general, there's like a tendency in ETH where there's this like strong concept of identity, where a lot of the solarpunk apps, such as quadratic voting, require strong concepts of identity. Lunarpunk is moving away from that. It's more into anonymity and like even pluralistic identities, or like having weak concepts of identities. And again, because we believe that anonymity is like a generative space, it's a garden, it's a forest, you know, it's a creative space of potentiality. So Lunarpunk is really like about defining these new futures beyond the confines of the surveillance state and allowing anonymity to be like a fertilizer for these new non-state spaces. So that's like a quick synopsis.